Hi everyone, thank you very much for coming. I feel like Norma Desmond with these lights. I'm ready for my close-up. So I'm Liz Evers, and this is my colleague, Dr. Niamh. Just Dr. Niamh, Dr. Niamh Gallagher. Yeah. And we're from the Dictionary of Irish Biography. And we're going to talk about some of the characters from our recent book, Irish Lives in America, under the theme of storytelling through biography. So I suppose we want to just illustrate how some of the people that we chose help to tell the story of the Irish immigrant experience in America, and also the contribution for good and sometimes for bad of the Irish in America. So first, I'd just like to give a little bit of context about the dictionary. Now, some of you may have already been out and spoken to some of my colleagues in the council room at the front of the building, but just in case you didn't. So the Dictionary of Irish Biography is Ireland's national biographical dictionary, and it has currently nearly 11,000 entries in it, and they're produced by over 700 contributors. And it ranges from the earliest times right up to contemporary figures, 21st century figures. And it's all freely available online since last year when Micheál Martin launched it in March 2021. And 11 volumes have been also published. So if anyone has any questions about the dictionary or wants to peruse it, we can visit us out in the council room at any stage during the day. So I'm going to hand over to Niamh now, who's going to introduce the book and one of the first characters in it.
Okay. Thanks, Liz, and good morning, everyone. So, as Liz has told you, the Dictionary of Irish Biography tells the story of our island through the biographies of prominent Irish men and women. Of the almost 11,000 lives featured in the dictionary, more than 400 were individuals who died in America, most of whom were born in Ireland. When we were putting together our book, Irish Lives in America, we wanted to bring together a selection of biographies that gave a sense of the significant impact of the Irish in America. In the field of politics and administration, for example, Irish immigrants were governors and military leaders. They were signatories to the Declaration of Independence. They were framers of the Constitution and even presidents. 23 of America's 46 presidents claim Irish ancestry. And in the War for America's Independence, 11 of the 56 delegates of the First Continental Congress were born in Ireland, and 9 of the signatories to the Declaration of Independence were of Irish birth or ancestry. Our book spans 300 years. The earliest life featured is that of James Logan, a public servant and scientist who was born in 1674. And the latest biography we included is actress Maureen O'Hara, who only died in 2015. And with more than 400 lives to choose from, we had to apply a strict sense of criteria as to who we included in the book. So our biographies, their lives, they had to be born in Ireland. They had to contribute significantly, not just to Ireland, but to American history. And of course, they had to be interesting. Across 9 themed chapters, the book features individuals from a broad field of endeavour, from political figures to artists and entertainers, and from soldiers and scientists to slaveholders and abolitionists. We wanted to include individuals who shaped American history in many ways: the architect who designed the White House, the scientist who invented the submarine, the bookseller who founded the oldest publishing house in America, or the computer programmer who helped invent coding, to name but a few. We also wanted to have a strong female representation, and the 18 women we included hopefully captured the diversity of experience of immigration from the perspective of both men and women. In politics, some, such as William Johnson, born in Meath in 1715, walked a fine line between colonial administration and respect for Indigenous tribes. Others, such as John Morrissey, became almost legendary figures. Morrissey, nicknamed Old Smoke because of an injury he sustained, was a prize fighter who fought street battles against Bill the Butcher of Gangs of New York fame. He entered politics and founded America's oldest major sports venue, the racetrack at Saratoga. The Irish also played a significant part in the War of Independence. The first 2 recorded combat deaths in the Civil War were Irishmen. and in total more than 150,000 Irish fought on the Union side. And although fewer fought on the Confederate side, there were at least 6 Confederate generals of Irish birth, and units such as the Charleston Irish Volunteers were famed. Regrettably, many Irish supported the institution of slavery from the start, and one such figure was Pierce Butler. And I wrote Pierce, and normally you become very fond of the people you're writing about. In this instance, I loathed him and I couldn't wait to get him finished. Pierce was born in Ballintemple House, County Carlow in 1744. He was the 3rd son of Sir Richard Butler, and therefore not likely to inherit any lands or titles. In time-honoured fashion as a younger son then, he entered the army, to our modern perspective at the shockingly young age of 11, and by the age of 14 was a full lieutenant commanding troops at the siege of Louisbourg in French Canada. When he married a wealthy South Carolina heiress, he inherited vast tracts of lands and slaves and switched sides to fighting the British. As one of the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, Butler looked after his own wealth and interests by insisting on the inclusion of a runaway slave clause, which declared that all runaway slaves had to be returned, even if they crossed state lines into a free state. Having served 3 terms in the Senate, sadly, he died one of the wealthiest men in America.
Thanks, Niamh. And staying on the theme of wealthy men in America, we have Alexander Brown, and he was one of America's first millionaires. And I suppose we've chosen him today just to kind of, it's a common misconception, certainly one that I held, of Irish immigrants, that they were homogeneously poor. And that they had to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps to achieve this mythological American dream. But same as Pierce Butler, Alexander Brown was actually, quite well off when he emigrated to America in the first place. He was already a well-established linen dealer. And he went over and set up, he had a merchant fleet. He set up a very successful import-export business. He was importing Irish linens, he was exporting tobacco and cotton, and read into that what you will as to how they were acquired in the first place and then sold into the British market. And he also established the country's very first private bank, which is still in existence today, and also a merchant bank. So he was massively successful. He also established one of the earliest railroads. And so I suppose it's that thing of in the book, we were trying to dispel the myth somewhat that there was a lot of very well-heeled Irish people in America, now certainly amongst the earlier wave of migrants. And so we have a section there which kind of is focused on people who were particularly successful in business. And so joining the likes of Alexander Brown, we also have another Alexander Turney Stewart, who was a pioneer of the department store. And he opened what was called his Marble Palace in New York in 1862, which was the largest purpose-built department store in the world at the time. And again, he had a fairly good start already in terms of establishing his empire. He didn't pull himself up by his bootstraps by any means. Another interesting person that we have, who again was very successful and another Irish millionaire in America, was Richard Kyle Fox, who was a pioneer of tabloid journalism. And we have him to thank, really, for a lot of tabloid journalism that evolved from his National Police Gazette. That was a 19th century publication, started in the mid-19th century. Well, he took over. And it was known as the Bible of the barber shop. And he also, it was quite racy, and lots of gory stories and pictures of girls. And he also contributed massively to the popularisation of boxing. And so when he died in 1922, he was also fabulously wealthy. But of course, this is just a sample of some of the diverse cast of Irish immigrants in America that are featured in this book, and also in the broader Dictionary of Irish Biography. As Niamh said, we had a lot to choose from. But I'll hand over now to Niamh, who's going to talk about a very different type of Irish immigrant. I'll let you do that.
So one of the most fun sections I found actually was the frontier section, because I grew up watching Westerns with my parents and I loved the Clint Eastwood. So I always had a vision of, the the poncho and the cheroot and the drawl. And in actual fact, what we discovered was there was an awful lot of Dundalk accents out in the West. So American frontier history and legend has long been dominated by this lone, grizzled man leaving behind home and family to brave the undiscovered wilderness. And the real frontiers people were far more diverse. They were European and Native American, of African and Spanish descent, individuals and, of course, families. And our frontiers people reflect that wide diversity. We included Elizabeth Jackson, the mother of Andrew Jackson, who ventured behind enemy lines to rescue her sons. We had Mary Jemison, who lived among the Iroquois tribe and who documented her life there. And we had John Wallace Crawford, who travelled with Wild Bill Hickok and gave us the Wild West show. But one of my favourite ones was a Wild West stereotype who actually existed, and he was Thomas Broken Hand FITZPATRICK. He hailed from Cavan and is regarded as one of the greatest mountain men who ever existed, and he was everything you might expect from the movies without the accent. He started as a fur trapper and then guided wagon trains that headed west. He was with Jebediah Smith when they opened up the overland route through the Rockies, and he guided the first 2 wagons to the Pacific coast. Known as Broken Hand by the Native Americans because of a rifle accident that mangled his hand, he convened the largest ever Native American council and insisted on just and honest relations with them when he negotiated their treaty. So really, really interesting man, loved him.
And another very interesting man is John Philip Holland, which I'm a name that a lot of you will be familiar with, and a man from Clare who was the inventor of the submarine. And we have him here to illustrate the contribution of Irish immigrants to the areas of science, technology and medicine, which was considerable. So he was born in Clare in 1841 and he became a maths teacher in Ireland, and he actually emigrated when he was in his 30s, and he settled in New Jersey. And he'd long been tinkering with the idea of creating this vessel that could be submerged. And he actually initially offered the patent for it to the US Navy in 1875. And they said no, they actually declined it rather rudely. So he ended up developing the vessel himself with funding from Clan na Gael. And the initial idea was that this would give the Irish revolutionaries the edge over the British Navy because they didn't really have many advantages. So at least this was one thing they might have. So this helped him develop his early prototype, and it took many years and many prototypes before he was able to create a vessel that could stay submerged for any length of time. And then the US Navy caught wind of this and were very much on board around 1900, and they commissioned a fleet. And then ironically, that ended up, the plans were then sold to the British Navy. So they did end up with a submarine, and Clan na Gael and the Irish revolutionaries did not. I'm not 100% sure how Holland felt about that. I'm sure he was glad to have just been able to do his work. So other figures who are in the book who demonstrate that, extensive contribution of Irish immigrants to the fields of science, technology and medicine. Kay McNulty, who you alluded to, she was a computer programmer. She worked as a human computer during the Second World War, calculating ballistic missile trajectories. And then she was amongst the very first programmers of the ENIAC machine, which was the world's first digital general-purpose electronic computer. And it was the size of a room, a huge room, massive thing. But obviously, it was absolutely groundbreaking work. And that's why my laptop that I'm using here exists. So we also have Dr. John Crawford, who's in the book, and he's a much earlier figure. He was born in 1746, but actually, when you read about the work that he did, it seems now that it's kind of hard to believe that this work was happening at that time in the 18th and then into the early 19th century. So he was a pioneer of insect-borne disease, the theory of insect-borne disease, back when everyone believed that miasma was responsible for everything. So he was quite a radical figure in that regard, and he was ridiculed as a consequence of suggesting that yellow fever was transmitted by insect bite and not swirling clouds in the air. And he was also one of the first doctors to introduce the smallpox vaccine to America, which was, I think that was 1813. So it just seems crazy that vaccinations were happening like 200 years ago. and he was very much a pioneer in that area as well. So I'll hand over to Niamh again, who's going to talk about Albert.
So, obviously, by its very nature, the people that we include in the Dictionary of Irish Biography live extraordinary lives. They've done impressive and important things. So, when we were writing the book, we wanted to include people who were chosen not because they were extraordinary, rather it was their very ordinariness, but the circumstances that surrounded them that made them that kind of extraordinary person. Margaret Hottery, for example, was orphaned, widowed, illiterate, destitute. So certainly not an auspicious beginning, very different to the men that Liz was talking about. And yet she went on to become one of America's greatest philanthropists and had the first publicly erected statue to a woman erected to her in New Orleans. Cork woman and widow Mother Jones would be known to anybody who knows their union history. Again, a widow and founder of one of the greatest union movements in America. Domestic servant Margaret Marr represents all the women who left Ireland to enter domestic service, but her great contribution is the role she played in preserving the poetry of Emily Dickinson. A beloved family domestic servant, she kept Emily's poetry, went against her wishes and didn't have it destroyed, and that's why we enjoy her poetry today. While, of course, Annie Moore has been immortalised in a statue welcoming all immigrants that land at Ellis Island. One particular life that typifies this ordinary experience is Albert Cashier, who fought on the Union side in the Civil War and was commended for bravery under fire. Albert remained illiterate and poor throughout his life, but wore his uniform with pride on Veterans' Day and was buried with military honours. What makes Albert unusual is that he was born Jenny Hodgers in Clogherhead, County Louth in 1843, but he lived his entire life in America as a man. When his secret was eventually discovered, many of his old army comrades rallied round to insist that Albert was entitled to a military pension. And when he was buried in his full uniform and insisted that the name Albert was on the headstone. So that was Albert Cashier.
Okay, so just going to conclude now with the glamorous portion of the people in the book. So we have Carmel Snow here, who is, well, she's representing a few different things. I suppose the contribution of Irish immigrants in America into the publishing industry in particular. So she was the editor of both Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. So she joined Vogue as the editor in 1929 and then took over at Harper's in 1935. And among her credits are introducing fashion designers Christian Dior and Cristobal Balenciaga to the American market, as well as the Irish designer Sybil Connolly. And she also gave so many young writers their first big breaks, including the likes of Truman Capote, and she also fostered the work of other writers like Frank O'Connor and Evelyn Waugh, amongst many, many others. So she's kind of representative of this much broader cohort of pioneers in publishing and literature. Another figure that comes to mind is Peter Fenlon Collier, who made a huge contribution in quite a subtle way. So he established this kind of very mass production of books, basically. He produced 60 million books over a 3-decade period, and he invented the kind of buying books by instalment plan, which meant that it opened up a market for classic literature to ordinary Americans for the first time. So people were able to have access to the kind of books that were very exclusive up until that period of time in the 18th and into the 19th century. So we're very tight on time. I think I've got a minute left. So last but not least, obviously, is Maureen O'Hara, who is the sort of the newest entry in the book. She died in 2015, but obviously she was born in 1920, and she's sort of emblematic of all of the different Irish people who went over as entertainers and went over to Hollywood and elsewhere with mixed fortunes. And other people who feature in the book are theatre actors and producers. We have Geraldine Fitzgerald, we have Mary Manning, we have the film director Rex Ingram, who'd be famous for the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. We have the singer, John McCormack, who is arguably the world's first pop star. star. But O'Hara obviously is this iconic person who very much retained her Irish roots, perhaps to an exaggerated degree, and played into the fantasy of this Irish Catholic Colleen in her best known role obviously as Mary Kate Danaher in The Quiet Man. So I hope with this whistle-stop tour that we've gone a little way to showing how through the curation of biographies from the Dictionary of Irish Biography, you can tell a broader story. And in this case, it's the story of Irish emigrants in all their diversity to America. So thank you very much.